This is a beautiful song, but it's about one of the darkest events in the history of mankind: slavery. Slaves and descendants of slaves have sung this song for centuries. It's about hope, but it also has a secret message. During this lesson you will learn this secret and more about the end of slavery. Slavery has been around for centuries. Men, women, children were captured, sold, and abused. Slavery happened in every time period, but the effect of slave trade from Africa still has a lot of influence on our daily lives. The two women that you see on the slide both have different ancestry and a background story, but they also have a lot in common. They are both called Harriet, and they fight against slavery. Harriet and Harriet have inspired millions of people. Which part did they play in the abolishment of slavery? How and when did slaves get their freedom? Before we can answer these questions, we first have to look further back in time. On slide 2 you can see the triangular trade. In chapter 2 we learned that the Europeans had taken over big parts of America during the 17th and 18th century. They built plantations and they dug up gold and silver from mines. The Native Americans were used as slaves, but many of these Native Americans died because of violence and diseases, or they were saved by the Spanish monk de las Casas. So who had to do the hard work now? To solve their work problem, the Europeans traveled to Africa. There they traded their wares, such as mirrors, weapons and alcohol, with local chieftains. The Europeans got prisoners in return. These African slaves were brought to forts and put on ships under terrible conditions. They were jammed together as if they were lifeless products. The journey to America took weeks, and there was not enough water or food for everybody. There were also diseases on board, so part of the slaves died before they reached the New World. The slave traders had already kept in mind that they had this loss. Imagine how inhumane you can be. There will be more horrible facts during this lesson. So these slaves were sold on markets after they arrived in America. Families and loved ones were torn apart and never saw each other again. What followed was a life of work on a plantation, without getting money, with barely enough food and something to drink, and a lot of harsh punishments. A whole life of slave work. Let's go to slide 3. So slavery didn't stop after people were taken from Africa. The slaves built new families in the New World in America and they got children. But these children automatically became slaves by birth. They were sometimes sold to another plantation. And this is how widespread trade in people started. This human trafficking was humiliating and traumatizing. If you were strong, pretty, or healthy, you would be more valuable, as if others would be selling you like livestock or a lifeless product. On slide 4 you can see that the Dutch also played a part in the slave trade. There were plantations on Aruba, Bonaire, Curaçao and in Suriname. Sugar and other products were picked by slaves and put on ships. These ships went back to Europe to sell the products for a lot of money. The merchants got all the profit. They didn't pay the slaves, but kept all the money for themselves. On slide 5 you can see that life on the plantations was tough. Not every white plantation owner was very strict. Some gave their slaves more freedom, but there were also those who let the slaves work themselves to death. Look at the scars on the man's back. These were the results of being hit with a whip. Complaining, taking a rest, or singing a song were sometimes reasons for a plantation owner to abuse his or her slaves. People sometimes ask me why slaves accepted this life. Why didn't they fight back? Well, let's go to slide 7. They did fight back. There were a lot of slave revolts, big and small, but the slaves only had a few weapons and weren't trained like European soldiers with rifles. They also knew that they would be punished severely if they failed. Punishments that were more terrible than death. But there have been successful revolts. One reason for this was that some slaves trained themselves in secret. They learned skills to fight back. One example is capoeira. This martial art form from Brazil looks like a dance, and when the slaves would practice together it seemed as if they were dancing and singing, but they were actually practicing to learn kicks and punches to take out their masters. The female slave rebel Dandara was a master in capoeira. Together with her husband, she led a group of runaway slaves in the jungle of Brazil. With her army of women, she attacked Portuguese and Dutch plantations to liberate slaves. The slave Tula started a revolt on Curaçao. His rebellion was quelled, and he was terribly punished and murdered. All his bones were broken, his face was burned, and he was decapitated. But he is one of the most important freedom fighters of the Netherlands. Because of him, the Dutch government forced the plantation owners to treat their slaves better. Well, it's sad to say that most revolts weren't successful. The slaves that survived were captured and used an example to scare others into obedience. Well, if you don't like terrible punishments, then close your ears and eyes for a moment, because on slide 8 you can see some brutal punishments, such as whiplashes, hanging, cutting open the stomach and being hanged from your intestines, or boiling alive in hot liquid sugar. Let's move to slide 9 very quickly. So slaves fought back, but weren't always successful. But luckily there were more and more people in Europe and America who were against slavery. We call them abolitionists, from the word to abolish, which means to stop. Well, during the 19th century there is a struggle between those in favor and those against slavery. And both sides have their own ideas and own reasons. We're going to learn about both of them. Let's start at slide 9 and continue from there. So why were people in favor of slavery? Well, reason 1 is slave owners felt that blacks were an inferior race. This came from a feeling of white superiority and racism. On the picture you can see that Europeans felt that they had to bring people of color to civilization, as if they were barbarians. The second reason is a biblical story. The Bible tells us the story of Noah. Remember the man with the big boat and the flood? One day after the flood, Noah was in his tent. He was drunk and asleep, naked. His son, Cham or Ham or Sem, entered the tent, sees his father naked, and runs to his brothers to laugh about it. His brothers do not laugh, and instead they go into the tent and cover their father with a blanket. Noah is infuriated when he wakes up. How could Cham laugh at him? Noah curses Cham. He and his children and their children will be slaves until eternity. Well, a bit of a harsh punishment, I guess, but the Europeans believed that Cham was the ancestor of all African people, and that made all the Africans slaves. Well, I never said that this was a good reason for slavery, but it was one of the excuses they used. There's also a third and a fourth reason. Those in favor said that it was no problem because slaves had already been slaves in Africa. And they feared that the economy would collapse if they would have to pay workers instead of using slaves. So, these reasons give you some insight in the heads of those who are in favor of slavery. Luckily, there were also people who were against slavery. And this brings us to the first Harriet that I started this presentation with, the American Harriet Beecher Stowe. She became famous for writing a book, Uncle Tom's Cabin. In this book she described how bad slavery was by giving examples. I will read a small part of this book now. It's a conversation of two men that talk about their slaves aboard a ship.
"Just feel my knuckles now. Look at my fist," said slave owner Legree. "I tell you, sir, the flesh on it has become like a stone by knocking down niggers. Feel it."
The stranger applied his finger to the implement in question and simply said, "It's hard enough, and I suppose," he added, "practice has made your heart just like it."
"Why, yes, I may say so," said Legree, with a hearty laugh. "I reckon there's little soft in me. I tell you, nobody fools with me. Niggers get round on me, not by complaining and not by tricks. That's a fact."
"You have a fine lot there," said the stranger, pointing to the slaves.
"True," said Legree. "There's that Tom. I pay high for him, tending him for a driver and managing chap. He'll do prime when he knows who's boss. I don't like that older woman. I think she's sickly, but I put her through for what she's worth. She may last a year or two. I don't go for saving niggers. Use up and buy more. That's my way. Makes you less trouble, and I'm quite sure it comes cheaper in the end."
Simon Legree sipped his glass. So this story about Tom, who is the main character, is fictional, but it's based on facts.
Harriet describes racism and slavery so well that she is able to get the attention of millions of Americans and Europeans. Uncle Tom's Cabin becomes a bestseller, and it helps to support the people who are against slavery. More and more people understand how bad it is. But what can they do? And why is slavery bad? Let's take a look at why people were against slavery. Well, the first reason for abolitionists was that in the Bible, Jesus tells his followers to treat everybody nicely. Think about the golden rule. Do not do to others what you do not want them to do to you. Well, the second reason came after the Enlightenment. Thanks to enlightened thinkers, it became more important to believe in freedom, equality, and brotherhood. So this would also mean that slaves were equal to others. That's why slaves were freed after the French Revolution. The third reason is that some economists believed that slavery stopped the countries from becoming wealthier. They said it was better to pay workers. They used the north of the United States as an example. There were no slaves there, and it was more prosperous than the south of the United States. Let's continue to slide 19. Like I promised, there was another Harriet and a song with a secret message. Well, some abolitionists didn't want to accept that slaves were mistreated. They helped them to escape, and they organized a route from north to the south of the United States. And it had shelters along the way. It was called the Underground Railroad. Harriet Tubman was a slave herself, but she escaped with the help of people from the Underground Railroad. But Harriet didn't relax when she was free. She wanted to save her family members as well. She worked hard and used the money that she earned to travel back to the South in secret. The trips to save slaves were challenging. It happened during winter because it was dark for a long time and people were inside. Everything had to be done in utmost secrecy because bounty hunters and their dogs searched for runaway slaves. They wanted a reward for bringing them back to the masters. The song, Wade in the Water, is about this. It seems like a simple song, but it was sung by slaves to spread a secret message. Walk through the water when you escape, because then the dogs will lose your scent and you can escape. Harriet was able to save her family and another 70 people. From that moment, she got Moses as a nickname, named after the prophet in the Bible who saved the Jews from Egypt. Harriet was never taken to prison and she never lost a slave. Even during the American Civil War, she worked for the Northern Union states as a nurse, cook, scout, and spy. She guided soldiers when they attacked plantations and was able to save 750 slaves this way. One more fact. During a train trip to New York, the conductor asked Harriet to sit in the luggage section because of the color of her skin. Harriet didn't want to do this and the conductor got mad. He grabbed her and pulled her to the luggage. By doing this, he broke her arm. Other passengers were complaining and shouted that he should throw her off the train, so they were all against her. Well, today Harriet is a hero for most Americans. She was supposed to be the first black American and the first woman to be on a dollar note, but President Trump stopped this at the last moment for no apparent reason. Let's take a look at slide 20. The abolitionists were successful. Slavery was forbidden. First the trade ended, and after a few years all the slaves were released. You can see the years of their freedom for a few countries here. In the United States it went a bit different. In the country of Harriet and Harriet, the tensions were rising and rising. All hell broke loose when Abraham Lincoln became president. He wanted to end slavery, and this led to a civil war. Americans fought against each other. The slave states in the South fought against the free states of the North. The war lasted between 1861 and 1865 and cost about 800,000 deaths. After years of war, the North won and slavery was forbidden. After the war, the two women kept on fighting for equal rights. Harriet and Harriet both felt that everybody should be equal, no matter your age, color of your skin, or being a man or a woman. Today, people still fight against racism and slavery. In slide 21, you can see the anti-slavery monument in Amsterdam. It took a long time before the Dutch government openly talked about the horrors of slave trade. Luckily, this is in our history books now,
because the consequences of slave trade still play an important part in the history of the United States, Europe and Africa. Think about the Black Pete discussion. More people start to think that Black Pete is a racist tradition that goes back to the time of slavery. Others think the opposite. Well, this leads to some aggressive debates in our country, and in the United States this situation is even worse. Not about Black Pete, but there is still a lot of inequality between white and black people. There are even violent groups on both sides fighting against each other because of the color of their skin. Luckily, there are also positive developments. One of these is TTO2, a Dutch festival that is celebrated every year on the 1st of July to remember the end of slavery. I hope that in the future we can look further than the color of our skin. Together we can stop racism. Let's look at what unites us, and let's celebrate this together.